Big challenge for game devs, pretty much since day one of gaming as a medium, is that your players are always going to find new and innovative ways to break your game no matter how hard you try and protect yourself from it. If you've ever worked in any sort of job that involves customer interaction, or have ever done a group project, you will be extremely familiar with the average human's capacity to screw up literally anything if you give them the room to do so. And that is usually in a scenario where it's actively against their best interests to break things. When it comes to gaming, the incentive is often to try and break the game in a way that benefits you, whether that's through outright glitches or bugs, or just through min-maxing your way and making the game limited, methodical, and uninteresting. A common expression about video games is that players will optimize the fun out of anything if you let them, and yet, so often it seems like it's the developers who are letting things get out of hand to begin with. Go through any gaming subreddit, especially if it's focused on a competitive game, and you'll see what I mean. Complaints about balance issues, exploitable bugs, mechanics not working as intended, and more. Players often seem like they're pretty quick on the draw when it comes to identifying an issue in a game. Not that they immediately get it right every time or anything, especially when they're content creators rushing to be the first one to upload their hot take about why a new character is broken or whatever, but they pretty frequently identify an issue and lock onto it with some degree of consensus as a problem that needs to be fixed. In a lot of cases, they even agree on the solution. This often leads to a good amount of frustration as it takes the developers weeks, maybe even months, to fix the problem. Sometimes they don't even fix the problem at all. Sometimes it's just allowed to drag on and on and on, with people getting more and more frustrated that the problem isn't being solved when we know how to fix it. So, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Why don't game devs fix obvious problems, especially ones with obvious solutions? We're going to look at this from a few different angles, so while I love getting comments from people, I do want to ask that you wait until you've seen the full thing to leave one, in case your point is addressed in a later part of the video. Also, this video is a members' choice video. This was the winning topic in a pretty close vote for the August poll, and since I think doing 5 topics was maybe a bit much, we're going to be going back to 4 for the September poll. And those options are: how Overwatch's cosmetics create a culture of classism, focused on how Overwatch monetizes its cosmetics and how that in turn affects the culture that builds up around those cosmetics. The philosophies of Overwatch's heroes, which would be about the various philosophies of different Overwatch heroes and organizations. Importantly, if this one wins, it'd probably be a longer video and it would take a while to finish. Cyberpunk 2077, the importance of understanding your genre, looking into how Cyberpunk 2077 missed the mark on the important themes of its genre in a way that undermined its narrative. And ELO Hell and Why We Cope, which would be about why people believe in things like ELO Hell and how people cope with their failures, real or perceived, in the context of a competition or a competitive game. If you'd like to support the channel and get to vote for one of these 4 topics, you can become a channel member by clicking the join button below for $5 a month. My channel members are a huge part of why I'm able to do this stuff, and their support is greatly appreciated. Alright, on to the video. Part 1. Is it a lack of QA? QA, or quality assurance, is a big challenge when it comes to any video game because you can only do so much. You can bring in playtesters and bug hunters and all these people, but when it comes to a game like Overwatch, it's impossible to predict what kind of stupid shit players will come up with themselves. There are so many overlapping abilities and mechanics and playstyles that it's hard to fully anticipate how any individual decision will play out, even before you consider the fact that you're trying to release a game that's playable from the very bottom of bronze to the very top of the Overwatch League. There are generally 2 versions of the answer to this question that you'll see online: a charitable version and an uncharitable version. The uncharitable version is that the devs are just lazy, that the developers can't be bothered to do proper QA, that they don't know how to play their own game, so of course they screw up and make a bad game with obvious flaws. The charitable version is that there's no way to do perfect quality assurance for a live service competitive game like Overwatch because it relies on too many variables, to the extent that even the best QA is gonna let some stuff slip through the cracks. Now, I think that the uncharitable approach is particularly silly. That's not how QA works. Developers do the work and then it goes to QA. The devs aren't the ones who are doing all the QA themselves in a big company like Blizzard. The whole reason to have QA and playtesters is that you recognize that developers probably aren't the best people for critically evaluating their own game for any number of reasons, and you need a fresh pair of eyes to do proper checks. However, I think that the charitable approach is also maybe being a bit too charitable. It's not the fault of developers, but executives absolutely could choose to invest more in QA work. What's more, it's executives who set the direction of the game and are responsible for managing their teams, and that is the source of a lot of QA issues. Quality assurance is a slow, time-consuming, expensive process, not just in terms of performing the QA checks themselves, but also in terms of that feedback being sent to developers trying to incorporate it, and then it being sent back to QA for another round. There's an expression in Canada that our unelected, unrepresentative, and undemocratic Senate serves as the house of sober second thought. The idea that its unelected nature, freedom from term limits, and more recently secession from the traditional party structure that the rest of federal Canadian politics follow, all collectively enable it to think more calmly and rationally about legislation, allowing them to review it without the divisiveness and partisanship that the House of Commons embodies, and to provide thoughtful feedback for the House of Commons to take into account. A quality assurance team serves a similar purpose as the House of Sober Second Thought. These people aren't the developers who've poured their blood, sweat, and tears into this product, nor are they the executives or shareholders. Their whole job is to be a neutral party who can make sure that the game works properly. The problem with that is that sober second thought is incompatible with rapid turnaround when it comes to game development because it inherently requires too much time. This is an industry built on crunch culture, and maybe more than any other part of the game development pipeline, quality assurance doesn't work if you try and rush it. That's particularly true when a game is especially complicated, and when it comes to Overwatch, each new hero and map increases that complication, in turn increasing the workload significantly. Like when Ana was released, she was the 22nd Overwatch hero, meaning that she had to be tested against 21 other heroes plus a mirror matchup to ensure things worked as intended. Illaria was the 38th hero added to the game, meaning that she had to be tested against 16 more heroes than Ana did. Even if you gave the team enough time to do QA work for Ana, you need to give them significantly more time to do the same level of quality of QA work for Illaria, and that's a problem when you're committed to releasing a new hero every 4 months. This isn't a unique problem to Overwatch either. The Pokemon franchise is notorious at this point for insisting on keeping the same kind of release schedule they were using when an entire Pokemon game would fit on a 32 megabyte cartridge, even as Pokemon games get bigger and bigger and bigger. It leads to worse games because executives don't want to delay releases or lose out on cash, especially if it's a franchise where they know people will pay, so they'll just shovel out a release without giving it the time to be properly finished or polished. However, at the end of the day, this framing of the problem ignores an obvious counterargument. The players serve as some degree of quality assurance when they play the game, find issues, and report them. Even if you accept the most uncharitable interpretation surrounding quality assurance, that doesn't explain why a problem might take ages to be fixed even after the community has clearly identified it. So, what's the problem there? Part 2. Why not listen to the players? Because gamers are fucking morons. Moving on. Part 3. Why do developers... No, alright, that's not fair. Not all gamers, etc. This is an actual question, and it kinda does need to be acknowledged more in depth. I mean, sure, sometimes it's being made in bad faith, but there are a lot of people who genuinely want to know why devs don't seem to look at their own subreddits or at their own forums or whatever else to find out what's bothering the players of their games. And I think that's kind of the part of this that's the most important to address. After all, from an outsider perspective, if you're Blizzard, you have a mountain of feedback to peruse at your leisure. Why don't they take proper advantage of it? Well, that's actually kind of part of the problem. It is a mountain of feedback. Have you ever, been in a situation where multiple teachers have marked a single piece of work and all offered conflicting pieces of advice? Imagine that, except hundreds of thousands of times over. How do you possibly ascertain what to prioritize from that? It would take an entire team of people just to compile it all into a single place, let alone actually start filtering it into something usable. Also, keep in mind, these people have actual jobs, and given that they work in game development, a sector that is infamous for crunching employees and working them to the bone, they probably don't actually have a ton of spare time to be browsing Reddit for your hot takes, especially because they probably don't want to spend their free time thinking about work and stressing out about it because someone with zero qualifications thinks they can do their job better than them. Actually, that's another thing. Most of the people offering their hot takes are not game developers. There's a reason why they don't just hire some random dude off the street to manage their team, and it's because even though you might think you know how to balance a game better than developers, you honestly probably don't. This is a bit of a niche example, but stay with me here. Back before Battle Royale popped off with Fortnite and PUBG, there was a little indie Battle Royale game called The Culling that I really, really loved. It had random spawns, item drops, crafting, loot crates, currency you could earn to call in care packages, and perks you could pick in advance to affect your stats in various fields. It wasn't the most refined game, but it was really fun. It was a really good game. That is, until the devs started listening to the community a bit too much. Players would complain about a certain perk that they felt was bullshit, and the devs would generally try and cater to them, only to break the game more, leading to more complaints, leading to more bad decisions, until eventually the game just sucked and no one wanted to play it anymore. Eventually, PUBG and Fortnite came around and crushed it into dust, which is a shame because it had originally been a really, really cool take on the idea of a battle royale. At the end of the day, the developers are the professionals. They are the ones who know how a game should be built, what will work for it, what their vision for that game is, and listening to the peanut gallery is rarely the best way to get the best decisions made. This also ties into another problem with listening to the player base. You're only hearing from people who aren't happy with something, and that isn't actually a useful sample group because you can't really use it to judge how the crowd at large feels. People are a lot less vocal about things when they're generally pretty okay with them, or pretty happy with them, or liked it well enough, but not fanatically. How often do you actually click the like button on a YouTube video that you enjoy? Or a comment, leaving a comment or liking the comment that you enjoyed? How does that compare to how often you'd leave a dislike on a video that you didn't enjoy, or a comment saying that you didn't like a video? There's a heavy negativity bias in feedback when it's voluntary, particularly in this kind of environment, because people don't tend to go out of their way to say hey, this thing is good, keep it up. But they absolutely will go out of their way to talk shit about something that's inconvenienced or displeased them. We all have a bit of a Karen in us, and I'm no different. I mean, I've only ever left 3 reviews on Steam across the decade plus that I've been using it, and one of those was just so I could bitch about Zero Time Dilemma more. My point is that it can be really hard to tell when something is an actual problem as opposed to people just kinda whining. And the reality is, there are a lot of people who are just kinda whining. Think about it like this. What percentage of the people that you play with in solo queue would you describe as genuinely intelligent, thoughtful, and competent people who know what's best for Overwatch? Even if you aren't incoherently whining, you've got to remember you're being drowned out by 1,000 DPS mains who've gone 2 and 10 running in by themselves and then call their supports a slur. A lot of the feedback that people provide to Blizzard is along the lines of my main is being countered by something that's meant to counter them and I'm too stubborn to swap or learn how to deal with it. Please fix that problem. And that's just useless feedback. Even if there is a valid complaint being made, it gets buried in a lot of the whining, and it doesn't help that people suck at communicating clearly when there actually is a valid complaint. Like, you're worse at verbalizing your issues than you think you are. There's a reason why there are entire professions of public relations and communications out there, and it's because you need people who are professionals, who are trained in this shit, to actually get across what you're trying to say. Even if you have a valid complaint, it doesn't mean you'll always communicate it in a usable way, especially if you jump towards being a bit of an asshole at the first jump, which, it's the internet, especially on Reddit. Of course people jump to being an asshole at the first opportunity. All of these things together add up to a situation where player feedback gets pretty unusable, especially because, as has become a major point of discourse in recent days, the feedback doesn't come from nowhere. Content creators play a major role in steering the community's priorities, and that's the next bit I want to talk about. Part 3. What's the role of content creators? Something that's important to acknowledge at this point is that it's pretty easy to identify that there is a problem in a certain situation, but identifying what the actual problem is the hard part. If I'm driving and my car starts rumbling every time I hit highway speeds, I know that there's a problem, but I don't necessarily know what that problem actually is or how to fix it. I can take it to a mechanic and ask them to diagnose the source of the problem, but that takes some degree of diagnostic ability to actually be able to do that. The same is true of video games. It is a lot easier to identify that something is wrong than it is to identify what specifically is wrong. And obviously, that's a key part of fixing a problem. Now, when it comes to your car having issues, you'll probably just take it to a mechanic, explain the problem, and let them fix it. Or, I don't know, if you're like me, maybe you'll just drive around with the check engine light on until something explodes and you get stranded in Sydney. However, when it comes to Overwatch, there's an entire online ecosystem of people constantly publishing content where they proclaim that they have identified the source of a problem or that they have figured out the solution. They'll say that a certain hero is too strong or a certain ability is too weak and that fixing that will fix the game. The problem is that having a lot of YouTube subscribers or Twitch followers or whatever else does not actually make you inherently any more competent or qualified when it comes to any of this stuff. Overwatch content creators, and I am including myself here, are no more qualified to diagnose an issue with the game than your average Redditor. They just have more of a platform, and so there's an assumption that they know what they're talking about when they say some shit. The reason that this is a problem is that a lot of people will watch that content, assume that the creators know what they're talking about because they're in a position of authority with hundreds of thousands of subscribers, decide that their diagnosis is the correct one, and then propagate the idea that that's the solution to the problem. One person misdiagnosing a problem and ranting about it on a subreddit is one thing. One person misdiagnosing a problem and ranting about it to 500,000 subscribers is very much so another. If you're a developer, you can ignore the former problem as an insignificant blip on the radar in terms of feedback, but the latter is going to fully taint the feedback pool and make it significantly harder to actually find usable feedback reflecting the problems with the game, especially because the content creator will keep reinforcing their incorrect diagnosis over time, making video after video about it, whipping up their audience into a frenzy and leading to a massive group of people who are overloading the developers with unusable, angry feedback. Now, why do the creators do this? Is it because they're all evil and they want Overwatch to fail? I mean, I don't know, maybe they do, but the more likely culprit is that the algorithm rewards people for posting constantly, and the easiest way to get engagement is with angry clickbait. This creates two negative incentives. You inevitably sacrifice quality of commentary for quantity, and you sacrifice nuanced commentary in favor of whatever will get the most clicks. And it's obvious why people do this. It makes a shitload of money. Over the last 90 days on my channel, my RPM, which is revenue per 1,000 views, is about $5.15. Remember that that's for a much smaller channel that publishes once every couple of weeks, so those rates would probably be higher if you were someone like, I don't know, Flats. You might have seen this tweet floating around where people criticize Flats for trashing PvE for being cancelled and then praising it when it came out, and I specifically want to draw your attention to those view counts. 321k for the one proclaiming the death of PvE, and 152k for the one celebrating its release. Assuming an RPM of $5, that'd be around $2,435.95 in revenue. Hi, this is Editing Viv cutting in to say that I was initially just going to give a rough guess at like a lowball average view count for Flats' channels, to try and make this point, but while I was editing this, I kind of felt like that might seem a bit disingenuous or dishonest, and you know what, Flats would probably want me to give him his fair credit, so I decided to actually go and check and see what the actual average views were on each channel. Across 169 videos, my bad, I miscounted earlier, this is what the average views per video looked like on each channel. Please note that even if we assume a significantly lower RPM than mine of $3, that still adds up to almost $68,000 in earnings from those 88 days. And don't forget that this doesn't factor in his other two channels or his Twitch streams. And look, maybe this comes across like I'm picking on Flats a bit here, but I hope you understand that this isn't really about him specifically. We're using him to talk about the financial incentives that exist to proclaim that you have the answer or at least know the problem, and to spread that message to your audience. you can make a shitload of money doing so. And the fact of the matter is you make significantly less if you try to make content at a more reasonable pace where you can take your time to formulate coherent arguments or try to bring nuance to the table. That means that the dominant content creators for a game like Overwatch are the ones who are willing to confidently tell their audiences that they have the solutions to problems, despite having very little time to actually work on crafting their message. And the fire hose of content constantly gives their audiences new things to flood forums and Reddit with, making it impossible for anyone responsible for balancing the game to use any of it. Even if you said, well, why don't they just watch Flats or Silosa or whoever else themselves to get that information? The answer is that that wouldn't change the fact that these people are not game designers on Overwatch. And also, there's only so many hours in a day. Content creators have a lot of power to sway a narrative, and it's not always power that they wield particularly responsibly. When it comes to so-called obvious problems and their allegedly obvious solutions, most content creators are just the blind leading the blind, building community consensus around what the problem and solution are even if they're entirely off base, forcing devs to either ignore them and piss off their audience, or acquiesce and risk breaking things in the process. Despite what creators like Stylosa might say, they're not filters for community concerns. At best, they're Pied Pipers. And finally, there's an important element of... Part 4. What if it's not so simple? Let's say that none of the previous issues exist. The community has correctly identified an obvious problem and its solution, and now it's up to the devs to fix it. And then it takes weeks, maybe even months for it to happen. Why? Well, first of all, sometimes it's not actually a problem. Sometimes players and developers just genuinely disagree about what the game should be, and the problem that the community has identified is less of an actual problem and more just a complaint that a fish isn't good at climbing a tree. It happens. More often than not, though, it's that implementing a solution isn't just a matter of, like, snapping your fingers and the code magically appearing and working. Ask literally anyone who works in software engineering or coding or whatever, they'll be happy to tell you that it can be a real coin toss in terms of how long it'll take to fix a seemingly simple problem or implement a seemingly simple feature. Like, code breaks kinda just on a whim. It is a difficult thing to work with, especially when it's complicated shit. If you're a connoisseur of Overwatch content, you've probably watched a Marbler video or two where he goes over what an absolute clusterfuck of spaghetti code Overwatch sometimes is. Like, if the problem is something related to D.Va demeching, it's probably going to be an absolute nightmare to try and address. And then, of course, once you think you found a solution, you need to do some QA to try and confirm that you're not going to just be making the problem worse, or causing a brand new problem. This shit takes time, especially if it's something that involves conditions that are rarely met, or where fixing it requires addressing a core structural part of how the game works. This is especially important when it comes to situations where newer versions of older mechanics are implemented differently, such as how barriers have changed over time from Reinhardt to Ramatra, or when it comes to a unique ability that a hero has that's being affected by a new mechanic like Kiriko's ultimate fucking up Mei's wall, allowing it to do things it wasn't supposed to do. And keep in mind, you can't just drop everything to fix a single problem. You've got new heroes, new events, new maps, new modes, and a whole bunch of other problems with the game that you've also got to try and make progress on. Even if a problem might only take a few days, if that's all you were working on, there's never going to be a situation where it's the only thing you're working on. You also have to manage this while you're working in a team, and that can add some unintentional inefficiencies to the system. Not because they're a bad team necessarily, but just because there's always room for wires to be crossed or whatever. Again, remember what we talked about earlier in terms of it being easy to identify a problem but hard to identify the solution, because that is really a big part of this. For those of us who don't understand game development, we don't know what a reasonable timeline for any of this looks like. If you gave a first grader 2 math questions, one involving high school level physics and the other involving university level calculus, that kid can probably identify that both of them are math problems, and that both of them probably have a solution. They might even be able to identify which of the two is easier to solve, but they absolutely are not going to know what the process is for solving those questions. And if that 6-year-old started talking shit about why it's taking you so long to do your homework when there's only 3 questions, you might throw hands. I would imagine that if you're an Overwatch developer who's been asked to just fix Mercy by people who don't have a clue, you've probably been in the I'm ready to throw hands headspace for a while now. Now, I can already kind of hear one of the reactions that I think people are going to have to this, so I want to get ahead of it here. Part 5. Are you saying we can't criticize Overwatch's development? Absolutely not. Criticize away. Blizzard is a company that routinely fucks up, and even with all of this in mind, it's important to recognize that this is a product being offered to you, and it is entirely reasonable to want that product to meet a certain standard of quality, meet expectations, like, be what it's supposed to be. It's totally fair to be pissed about bugs and balance issues and all that other stuff. If you go to McDonald's and ask for no mustard on your burger, and then they put mustard on your burger, you're allowed to ask them to redo it. The point of the video isn't to tell you that you can't have feelings about how this game is managed, because frankly, that would just make me a hypocrite. I've made multiple videos critiquing things like balance or how the game communicates certain things to the player, and I don't intend to stop either. The point of this video isn't that you're supposed to be an uncritical consumer. The point is to talk about why this isn't as simple as the average dipshit in the Overwatch forums thinks it is, and why it's important to recognize the factors that play with this stuff in order to set expectations at a reasonable level. Otherwise, you're dooming yourself to be forever infuriated by everything this game does. It's not to say this game isn't going to be frustrating regardless, but you know what I mean. It's about telling you to recognize that the content creators who are constantly publishing a fire hose of hot takes are doing so because of a complex set of incentives that effectively penalize you for trying to make content slowly, deliberately, and methodically. And you should take it with a grain of salt when they say Overwatch 2 is dead or whatever, because their incentive is to get 100,000 people to click on their video, not to say something nuanced or particularly helpful. It's also about acknowledging that developers aren't really in control of very much of this game. I mean, sure, they're the ones programming it, but you know the difference in terms of what you can and can't do when you're given a 1-month deadline versus a 6-month deadline? Developers don't get to choose what they work on, or what's a priority, or what would be best for the game. That's for executives and their management. If you've literally ever had a job before, which I know is maybe a foreign concept to the unemployed people of r/Overwatch, you know that your boss will often set unrealistic or unreasonable deadlines for work to be completed, resulting in rushed work that is not your best and will eventually need to be fixed down the road. Developers are only human. They are working within a corporate structure that limits their capacity to make the game as good as it can be, and this stuff is often way more complicated than it's presented as. It doesn't help that Blizzard's communication routinely sewers them by being too vague, setting unrealistic expectations for players, or just straight up miscommunicating shit in a way that leads to developers getting hate for things they had no control over. Developers aren't deliberately refusing to address problems, or just sitting in the corner with a fucking dunce cap on ignoring balance problems. The answer to the question, why don't game developers fix obvious problems, is that it's often the result of all the factors we've talked about in this video and more. That it's not as simple as it seems, that players are often talking out of their asses by either misidentifying the problem or the solution, that influencers in the space are directly incentivized to rile people up even if it's over nothing, that they're working within a corporation that is notoriously poorly managed, particularly when it comes to Overwatch, and that there is so much feedback constantly being thrown at them by people who are bad at communicating it and are not experts in any of this that it becomes overwhelming and unusable. The short answer is that the premise of the question is just inherently flawed. It places blame on the developers for something that is not the fault of developers and is beyond their control, something that happens pretty often in this space. I'm not telling you to not ask questions. I'm telling you to ask better questions if you want better answers, and to ask them of the people with some degree of control if you want to do something about your displeasure with the answer. And that's where we're going to end this one. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member. Memberships are $5, last a full 31 days if purchased in August, and give you access to an exclusive badge, emotes, and the opportunity to vote for Members' Choice videos like this one. Speaking of, next month's Members' Choice options are How Overwatch's Cosmetics Create a Culture of Classism, The Philosophies of Overwatch's Heroes, Cyberpunk 2077, The Importance of Understanding Your Genre, and ELO Hell and Why We Cope. If you'd like to vote for one of those topics, you can join through the join button below or the link in the description. And thank you again to all my channel members. Insert name here: Mini Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Surtur Z, The Afro of Doom, Enval, Xander K, Gavost, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Vamplin, Popsneck, Lenny, Connor, Circo, Damp Weasel, Nature Big Fan, Yoshi of the Wire, and Peggy, CatLover192, Windex the Great, Sourdough, Luma Riley, Pandorana, and Venus. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just a viewer, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.